Welcome everyone to this session on the Dear Data project. What we're going to do today is Dr. Beverly, Fitzpatrick and myself were facilitators on this doctoral course in education, and Pat, Chinwe and Julia were students on the course. Pat organized this panel to give you an idea of what we did in this assignment. So Bev will introduce our thinking behind having the assignment, and then Pat, Chinwe and Julia will show you some of what they did, some of the data they collected in their assignments. The way we've organized it is that we, in line with the conference theme, we are looking at Mesereau's ideas around transformative learning, and there were three aspects of transformative learning that were particularly significant for these particular students. And those are these three here, and that's what we'll be focusing on. Okay, so the Dear Data project. This project was instituted by two data visualization experts. They have a website and a book, and we can pass that around if anyone wants to have a look at it. Yes, please. A very exciting way of looking at data. Basically what they did, Stephanie Posavec and Georgia Lupi, was that they would collect data over a week, and the data would be personal. So, for example, this data is a week of phone addiction. And then they would translate that data visually, represent it visually, and then display the data visually, and then have a key code on the other side of the postcard, and then they would post this to each other. So they mailed it to each other. So we asked the Education 702 doctoral students to do a similar kind of project. We asked them to collect personal data over a 3-week period. So they could collect the same data for the full 3 weeks, or they could collect different data for each week. But it had to be a personal topic. They were also required to represent their data visually in a creative way, and to reflect and interpret their findings. We asked them to work in pairs, but they weren't assessed as a pair. They were in pairs to bounce ideas off each other and to have a partner to discuss issues. We also asked them to reflect on the data collection process and on insights about themselves as researchers as they went through. So to give you examples of topics, Patrick worked on his 1 week was on his use of Twitter, and then the last 2 weeks were on his interactions with his dog, so noting his dog's behavior. Chinwe looked at 3 different aspects of her experience of taking the Metro bus as a student in St. John's, and Julia looked at demonstrations of love over the 3-week period. So what we'd like you to do, and this is why we've given you paper and a marker, is what we'd like you to do just to get a sense, a little taste of what the students were trying to do, is to represent your question. If you do have a question, represent it visually. So rather than writing out the question, try and represent it visually. So here you don't need to reproduce the Mona Lisa. We're not asking you to be artists. You can use stick figures, squiggles, symbols, lines, but just try and think more visually than you normally would. And at the end, perhaps you can show us, if you want to, what your question in visual form. Okay, without further ado, hand you over.
So am I, you can hear me? And the mic is on, Pat?
Yes, you're going.
Okay, great. What I'm going to talk about is the types of thinking that were behind getting students to take part in this project, and we were looking at creative and critical thinking. And very often, many people do not think of creative thinking and critical thinking in the same mind frame. In fact, they think of them as opposing forces, and some people, and maybe some of you, might even object to the point of view that I'm going to put forth here today. But we take the viewpoint when we assign this topic of Richard Paul and Linda Elder, who are from the criticalthinkingfoundation.org. Richard Paul died a year ago, and Linda Elder continues to work and write in the area of critical thinking. So when they're talking about critical thinking and creative thinking, they're looking at creativity as being the generative power behind our thinking, and then the critical part is the criticality. And in fact, they're positing, and it is the belief behind this assignment, that we don't separate critical and critical thinking, that it's an artificial separation. And there's a reciprocal logic, and I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. So if we look at the creative mind has high standards for what it generates. The creative mind is not loosey-goosey, doesn't matter what goes, what happens. The creative mind is still caring about the creation. And when we're talking about, if we look at the third bullet, the making of things, the creativity, and the ongoing critique. Just to give you an example of perhaps a dancer. A dancer is going to create a routine. A dancer practices that routine. The dancer is doing that routine in front of a mirror. At the same time that the dancer is creating the routine, the dancer is assessing the routine as well to see if it's meeting the standard. The dancer starts with a conceptual framework in mind, and some of that might develop as you go along, but the creating and the critiquing are happening at the same time as the dancer's going through the routine. And when the students here talk about their progress through this project, they're going to talk about some of that. For example, in our class, a couple of these students might say that we had some students in the class who were quite artistic in their judgment, and this affected their thinking as they went through. Pat's going to talk about making judgments from the beginning of his Dear Data project to the end, and changes that happened. So when he was trying to be creative, he was also thinking critically about how he was going through this creative aspect. Then we're thinking about reasoning as a creative act. So we're coming from the other perspective. And if we think about ourselves, all reasoned thinking, when we're trying to figure things out, even if it's something we've previously figured out, it's a new making. It's a new creation. And if we think about how we learn, and we talk about transformative learning, we use our experiences to bring meaning to new learning. And then we create our own meaning, which will have some commonalities which what other people are thinking about, but it will also have uniquenesses to us. We will have our own point of views. Even if we bring that back to constructivism, we bring it back to transformative learning. So there are commonalities with the world, and there are some unique parts of the meaning that we bring. We're constantly recreating old understandings to arrive at new understandings. And the human mind does some of this without us consciously thinking about it. The purpose of this project is to get our PhD students to acknowledge the interplay of the creative and the critical. And one more. So when we look at, again, having standards and have criteria, when we're talking about the high achievement, being able as PhD students to think critically and to think creatively, when we look at, first of all, we take for granted there's a minimal level of innate capacity, and that we have a positive response and an inner motivation. So these students, this will come out when they do their presentation, their responses, their inner motivation as they work through this project. But major for us, what's necessary is an environment that stimulates the development of that capacity. So when we put together this project, that was a fundamental purpose, to provide an opportunity for these PhD students to bring together that criticality, that judiciousness, with that creativity and that generative thought. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pat, who's going to talk about his experience. Yes, please.
Pickpocket. So, I'm a science teacher, and before that I was a fish biologist, and I'm here because I believe the Dear Data project produced transformative learning in every person involved with the project, including our facilitators. This project follows a pretty simple recipe, but solid. Target the heart, and the mind will follow. The unassuming, powerful aspect of this project was how each weekly data collection was a personal choice. We engaged the students to collect personal data, and there's the heart. So I ask you to be mindful of the differences you're going to see when we demonstrate, when we talk about our transformational learning. You're going to see how it touched each of us in very similar ways. This slide I start with is the science me. Okay, I'm a social science researcher now, that's what I'm planning to be, but this is the science me. Collecting data at the molecular level, and this project stretched the science me in terms of grappling with my attitudes regarding data and result presentations, but also I had several metacognitive events, and surprisingly, I also experienced a pleasant psychomotor change. I collected ethnographic data on myself with regards to Twitter, as was mentioned before, but I also looked at my dog's behaviors. And because of my past training, I had no problem just diving in and collecting data. That was not the issue. The issue was I wasn't in my comfort zone when it came to representing data as art. I like graphs, correlation coefficients, and I was certainly skeptical about the art representation of data. However, you know, based upon my influences from other people around me, and poetry and things like that, I followed the road not taken, chose the path that wanted where, according to Robert Frost, and my art started with stick figures, emojis, lines and numbers and things like that. And still, the numbers are there for me, right? I'm sorry. It's the whole biologist thing, right? And numbers inside emojis. So this is where I was. But I progressed from there, and as I drew and painted, you can see I changed a little bit. I didn't know this was in me, but this was, as Bev talked about, when you're trying to, if it's part of you, you're going to put your name on it. You're going to do your best. And I improved my artistic representation of my results because it was important to me. I mean, the art me, which I never knew really existed. But it did in my childhood. And as I painted more, I grew self-confidence and in my new role as a researcher and as an artist. And this is sort of step 9 from Cecile. So if you look, you can see like this is my dog Charlie. Okay, he's a Brittany Spaniel. And my development was both cognitive, psychomotor, transformational within me, and I liked it, so it was effective. But the effective was the start of this thing. But this transformation was not the most significant learning within this graduate project. I look at my collaborations with my partner as a source of learning, but also tension. And cognitive tension is a good thing. And this is yet another Cecile dilemma. My partner was the audience for my work. And we got together, we discussed codes and data representations. It was lovely social facilitation. But again, the science me was still there, and the working through these drafts of art data representations was uncomfortable. And that again, that's not such a bad thing. The data representations allowed me to find flaws in the way I was presenting things, and my partner told me that my representations were overly technical. You know, and that's me sort of tunneling down into things, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But I made critical assessments and change my perspective in terms of I need to make something, for me, I wanted to make something that people could look at and feel and get something from more tangibly. So I stretched my limitations in terms of my artistic expression, and this evolved, that's what evolved in my previous slide with the picture of Charlie. Now, I collected dog behavior. I collected Twitter data on myself, but my most interesting take from this stuff was my dog behavior things, because it brought out the new reflexive me. So this is my dog greeting me at the front door. Sometimes, well, most times the dog looks right at me. And other times I noticed that he doesn't. Now, before I started collecting this data, one of the things I did was for 2 days I said, well, what behaviors am I going to look at? So I went through and I decided on I was going to do a tail wagging, body curl, spin, pawing the ground, and snorting. The reflexivity comes in was on the second day when I noticed that I was getting different behaviors. I was getting pupil dilation, I noticed. So I decided to add that in. And even later, added in the not looking at me. this is what your dog looks like when he eats 18 moose sausages off your counter. It's like no eye contact. Oh, I screwed up really bad. All right, so now this kind of change on the fly is just not something I'm accustomed to as a science researcher. This would be like total reboot. Doing controlled experiments, if I was doing salmon respiration, which I did research on, if I was like, oh, this is something new, no, keep going. Reboot, restart. All right, and this was amazing for me because there was no dreaded redo. And I finally got what it meant really solid when my professors were always talking about being reflexive. Well, this is it. You respond. It was sort of really, as we saw in some presentations earlier, it was an aha moment, if I can use that from previous presentations. Now, the inconspicuous aspect of this project was how the weekly data collection connected to your worldview. So I collected self-data and behavioral data, but it was connected to me. And the data that I collected was interpretive and qualitative. And that's the new me, right? A common feature of my interpretations, though, was an attempt to take bits and pieces and try to build something with them, a reductionist point of view. And that's the old me. And as I looked through the literature on dog behavior, I noticed that there was also this conflict. But I realized, I mean, you know, I know, because I'm a biologist and I taught psychology and things like this, I can't take what I do in a classroom, even though I know it's neurophysiology, it's long-term potentiation, making memories. I can't focus on that. I need to address what I'm doing with my project. I'm looking at teacher learning, their behavior. That's it. That's my level of where I have to be. And that's surprisingly a big step for me. So my big take from the project was a really big change for me, was try to be concerned with the whole as I see it, and not try to assemble it from the sum of the parts. And that's a big step for somebody who's been trained for years and years and years to puzzle stuff together and come together with something that makes sense from the parts of the whole. So anyway, that's all I have to say about this. This is my dog, what he looks like when there's nobody in the house. And that, I didn't want to talk about that. That's physiological. That's sympathetic nervous system, right? But I couldn't be distracted with that. I had to be focused on the behavior. That's my story, and I can't delve into that. So anyway, without further ado, I pass the mic along to my partner, Chinwe. Oh, you got that one? All right.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Chinwe. I'm a doctoral student with the Faculty of Education, and I would like to talk about how their data transformed me. Okay, relating to what Bev said about learning, I also agree with Cecile that says you need to take your past experiences and engage them to understand something new and to help you with your future learning. So I enjoyed that quite a lot. So for the project, I identified with the three phases that Cecile identified: the disorienting dilemma, the critical assessment, and the building of competence and self-confidence. So I'm going to go through each phase one by one. Okay, so for my disorienting dilemma, when they introduced the topic, their data, I was kind of excited because it was different, right? And for someone like me that I enjoy playing a lot, I felt, okay, kind of taking me out of my academic comfort zone. But it was not so good because I trained myself to be this structured person to fit into the academic setting. And now I'm being asked to become art-based again. And I felt that would kind of confuse, because I've always kind of separated the creative and the academic. So for me, I had to think through and ask myself, okay, what am I going to focus on? What personal topic would I want to think about? And that helped me choose the Metrobus, because it was something personal. And I think I'd been having problems with some of the issues on Metrobus not coming on time, or leaving me under the rain. So I think I was kind of frustrated. So I decided to gather data on the metro bus. So the critical assessment came when we were asked to write our paper, our DARE data, to transform our DARE data project into an actual research paper. And when Bev mentioned it at the beginning of the year, I was kind of not happy. And I said it, that I wasn't happy, because I felt that the whole project was to take us out of the academic setting and to bring something a bit different, right? And this is not my, you've taken me out of my comfort zone, then now you're telling me to go back to what you're bringing me out of. So I felt it didn't really fit into the research methodology. I didn't mind writing a paper about the DARE data project, but I had a problem writing it as a research paper. So for me, that was the critical part of it, what I understood by research. And as I said, there are people in our class, Haley and Abina, they're artistic. They draw beautifully. And I felt that was an unfair advantage, because how was I going to represent my own work when they're used to art-based research and I wasn't? So building of competence and self-confidence, what I had to do was, going back to what Cecile said, what do I know about writing a research paper? What do I know about conducting a research? So I had to go back to my prior knowledge, and as Bev and the others talked in class, I paid attention, and I would write in my notebook structure of my paper. I decided to use the Imran structure, so I decided to do an introduction, do the methodology, the discussions, and the findings, because that was my own idea of having it, because as I said, I was trying to reconcile having the DARE data project and having the academic factor. So I needed something that would give me a bit of structure. So I decided that, okay, just follow a proper research paper format, and that would help you write the paper. Then I decided to develop a problem purpose statement. So I had to problematize everything. For the first week of the DARE data project, I collected data on who greeted first on the bus, whether the bus driver greeted me before I greeted him, or maybe I greeted him before he greeted me. So I had to problematize that, and I had to use things like customer service and the rest. Then I also had to collect data on the second week about the time factor, because they seem not to be able to keep to time most times. So I just wanted to collect data on that, right? So I had to look for literature on collecting data on time, punctuality, and how it affects customer service. So the third one, I looked at gender. So I was looking at the gender of whether it was a male bus driver or a female bus driver every time I go on the bus. So I collected data on that. And to try and ground my research, you have to use literature review. At least that's what we've been taught. So I had to get all the literature review to back up my work, to make it academic. So I had to gather data on employment equity and what he had to say about the Canadian sector, transportation sector. So that's what I did for the project. And doing that, I had to create several drawings, because we had to represent our data visually. So for each set, I had like different drawings of what I wanted my data to look like. After collaborating with my partner, him, we decided to, because I had like all these drawings and I didn't know which one to pick, so we decided to use that for my gender. And initially I had a big male and a small female within the male, trying to say, okay, I found more male transit operators than female, but it looked tacky, so we decided against that. So I decided to represent them in squares and circles, and I had to decide on the color. I just thought this was visually appealing, right? Red, black. Red is always like very catchy. So that's how I represented that data. Then, who greeted first on the bus? I wanted something that would represent customer service, feeling safe, feeling comfortable, feeling accepted. So I went with the umbrella setting, something like shelter, just to say, oh, I'm safe when I get on the bus. So I decided to represent my data that way. And collaborating with my partner again, he told me that the way I put my leaves was confusing him. So I had to realign my leaves to make sure that he understood. So I didn't submit anything until I had the go-ahead from him. So the collaboration was very helpful, because it helped me tone down and edit my work in that sense. okay, writing the paper. As I said, I used the Imran structure to write the paper. And what I learned in the reflexive part of the paper, because you had to put in a reflexive part about how it changed you, right? So I realized that I was a control freak. I knew I liked to be in control here and there, but I never thought I was like a control freak. So it just helped me understand that I wanted data that was simple, uncomplicated, because you need to see what my other classmates did. People talked about their dreams, analyzed their dreams, and rest, nail biting. I'm like, I'm so simple. Yeah, so I collected data very simple, not as in, did you come on time? Yes. Did you not come on time? No. Was there a gender? Yes. Male? Yes. Female? No. So it just showed me that I'm more of a simple. I'm not saying I'm simple all the time, but it gave me kind of like a window into my personality. I like to control things. I don't want things to overwhelm me, especially when I'm not very familiar with what I'm doing. So that kind of helped me understand who I was as a person. So the other way their data transformed me was, in my paper, I'd written that it wasn't a critical transformative paper. That I wasn't writing the paper to change the metro bus system. So I was going on a qualitative route because I was just exploring what happened on the bus. But 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, at the beginning of April, I got an email saying if you wanted to come and participate in a focus group concerning the bus issues in St. John's, email back. And I was like, yes, I need to make a change, and things like that. So my paper went from being qualitative to making me a critical transformative person. So it didn't just change me as, in the terms of, oh, how to take a mundane topic to being an academic topic. It changed me in, I want to participate in the community. I want to make a change. So it's transformed me into a community activist. So that's how my Dear Data went. Thank you very much.
No, I'm good. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Halfyard, and I work with the Student Experience Office with Student Life, but I'm also finishing my first year as a PhD student in education. I have a deep interest in arts and health and community and music, and I am a brand new researcher. So often researchers will undertake their first data collection research project solely as a means to study the art of research without any regard for personal connection, growth, or emotional catharsis. Certainly that was the case when I initially approached personal data collection simply as an arduous course requirement. However, through the journey of collecting, analyzing, and artfully representing, I discovered the poignantly ethereal voice of personal data collections through visual and oral representations. The Dear Data project is insightful, creative, and artful, and I was very excited about choosing a topic. I decided I would collect data on demonstrations of love. Specifically, I would track who deliberately and lovingly touched me, either physically or even digitally, with the intent to encourage, support, or love me. A simple glance at a recent highly traumatic experience would highlight what was most important to me in my life, and that was love. On July 23rd, 2017, last summer, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer and was immediately scheduled for a thyroidectomy. Even after that very successful surgery, I felt the emotional remnants of this trauma was great. I was lonely, afraid, and combined with another life crisis, I really didn't feel really very good. So consumed with sadness and fear, I clung to what mattered the most, my children. My children, Estelle and Seth, are happy, well-adjusted, sweet little children who love their mama. I clearly wrote that another time because I had a huge fight with my daughter this morning, so. She doesn't love me very much this morning, but we'll get over that. The Dear Data project would help illuminate the joy they bring at a time when I could really acknowledge beauty. In tracking demonstrations of affection, I felt I could look at all the intersections in a 3-week span, and the results would either lift my spirits or reinforce my situational gloom. Also during this time, I would be quarantined in hospital for a week for my final radioactive iodine treatment. I would be radioactive and be unable to be around people. So in those available 20 collection days, while I was working, mothering, socializing, hospitalizing, and PhDing, I collected 71 instances of touch from 28 individuals, including friends, colleagues, an acquaintance, a nurse, my children, 4 of my friends' husbands, a cat, and others. And very deliberate patterns emerged throughout the first 7 days. Mornings and nights were filled with loving touches from my children, while the work hours showed surprise demonstrations of affections from friends and colleagues. In creating a representation of this data, I decided I would represent it through a musical composition, but not through the traditional music theory methods. I would create music through data charting. And if I represented one touch as a full measure of music, I could visually and eventually orally depict the who, the what, the when, the why, and the how of the touch, as well as classify the type of love. This is time signature. I chose a very simple 4/4 measure to uncomplicate it, 4 notes per measure to reflect 4 of the 5 major categories of the data collection. In the 4 beats per measure, the first would represent the who, the second note the what, the third the when, the fourth the why, and the how would be represented through rhythm. How could I decide which key would best represent the data? To aid this decision, I looked to the composers to figure out what they described keys as. Many described it as gravity mixed with gaiety, melancholy womanliness, which I connected with, gentle sorrowing, affectionate, and contemplative. Indeed, I did deeply connect with these adjectives, gravity, melancholy, and sorrow, and while I embraced vulnerability, sadness, and used this really as a time of reflection and healing, I thought D minor was indeed the most perfect key. The who is the first note. So I assigned all 28 givers of affection an individual note on the scale. I knew my children would be highly prevalent, or hoped they would be, so I gave Estelle the tonic. There's our D minor scale. And I gave Seth the E4. Because of their close proximity, Estelle and Seth, when played together, they're very dissonant, which represents their childhood relationship. A little discordant, yet loving, clashing, but beautiful. What is the second note? I arranged the data into 4 categories. The snuggles would be tonic. The love rubs would be F4, the mediant. So that's when someone just, when someone just gently touches you or gives you a little tap. That was, I call that a love rub. The hug kiss was the dominant of the chord. Very important in a scale. That's the A natural. The digital love, which is really interesting, was a leading tone, either a C natural or a C sharp. And that always lends itself back to the tonic. Third note. For the mornings, the supertonic, thank you, the supertonic E natural. For the afternoon, the subdominant G. For the night, a B flat. And for the late night, an octave tonic. So the Y is the 4th note. Thank you. A child's love, foundational tonic. Naturally, it's where we all want to go. A greeting, dominant A, very secure and steady. Friendship love, supertonic E. Nursing compassion. And a colleague support was there. How is the rhythm of the measure? So I wanted to change it up a little bit. Personal love was 4 straight quarter notes, chosen because they're steady, secure, and unfailing. An act of kindness was a dotted rhythm, impromptu, joyous, unexpected, and party-like, like the skipping rhythmic dance or the fluttering heart of first love. I also see and hear support and love through friends and colleagues. Shannon, a blue C-sharp 5, gave me a love rub twice in a row in the morning, followed by a hug in the afternoon. The love rubs were categorized as colleague support, while the hug was a greeting. She saw me and hugged me. The dotted rhythm indicates an act of friendship. I'll play this for you. So this is Shannon love rubbing me twice. You see the 2 measures are identical. This is a hug now in the afternoon. Not only can I see the personality of my friend and colleague in this visual representation, but I also hear how she expresses concern and affection towards me when I play those 3 measures. I also embrace silence in this data collection. During my time in hospital, no one was allowed to physically touch me for close to 7 days. There could be no data to collect, but the emotions of these days are reflected in the 42 measures of silence. My hospital stay, in fact, allowed me the time to hear all the incidental sounds around me, like the uncomfortable 42 measures of silence in my data. It encouraged me to listen to what was going on instead of paying attention to what was missing. So you'll see, you'll see here, it's the silence is, well, it's very obvious. So I would like to play the entire 42 measures of silence. No, not at all. It would be so John Cagey of me. Anyway, but I will play just the top line for you, and I will give you 3 measures of silence. And I think that would sort of encompass the emptiness or the void of physical touch during those weeks. So it sounds like this. This is Estelle and Seth Snuggles in the morning. One day I'll play the whole piece. It would be very interesting. I'll probably be the only one that will be really into it. It would be so great. Throughout the entire project, I was gently reminded by the data how fortunate I was to be surrounded by people who cared for me at a time when I really felt very vulnerable. Perhaps I wouldn't have been so open to these small moments had I not been so aware, propelled by the data collection. On reflection, and by coincidence, I discovered that the first measure of the piece, the first instance of touch, and the last measure of the piece, the last instance of touch, really represented my children and the love for their mama. Measure 1 depicts a snuggle from Estelle and Seth in the morning as an act of child's love. And measure 112 shows Estelle and Seth snuggling me in the nighttime as an act of child's love. Acknowledging these acts of affection through visual and oral representation at the top and bottom of the data collection illustrates how very central they are to my world and how lucky am I to be blessed literally with love, to be bookended with love. The transformative learning for me was really building new competencies and confidence in my new role as a neophyte researcher. The introduction of the collection, charting, and analyzing personal data through a creative lens also demonstrated how data collection can be personal, fulfilling, poignant, artistic, and fun. Thank you very, very much.
So on that note, we invite you to share your representations of questions with us. And we'll do our best to answer them.
Or if you're too afraid, like I was initially, you can just ask.
Question at the back?
Can I describe what I'm drawing?
Sure, why not?
I have here, I think it's, yeah, it's on here. I have here drawn in a kind of light blue, in fact, it's called light blue, on a peach piece of paper, something that I thought was kind of like a brain with hearts and pieces of heart in them, and actually a question about your presentation. So you had described this as leading with the heart and the mind will follow. And this dichotomy between heart and mind comes up so often. It often comes up for me in the context of women in STEM, where there's kind of this, I don't know which wave it is now, of response of, well, women can bring the heart to the situation, or we have to trust our heart, or we have to, or that's an asset that we're bringing in. But I know that the heart is a pump, and that my emotions are in my brain just like my factual knowledge is. So if we can bring those two images together, how else could you describe that process? And I guess it's kind of like bringing the creative and the critical together. They're all happening in the same place. They're all equally valid networks of neurons. So I don't know, how do you respond to that? How does a heart, can you picture what you're calling heart as just neural networks?
Well, to me, the heart, what I'm speaking about in the presentation is a metaphor for finding something that will engage students, something that will effectively engage their affective domain with an attitude, something they like, something they find is beautiful. Like when I do things as a biology teacher, I will pass out a bunch of shells. Say, pick one you like. And this, but on a much higher graduate level scale, this project did that. It basically allowed us the freedom to pick what we wanted, and then it just grew from there. I mean, Bev, do you want to, or Cecile?
Add to that. So if we link it to adult learning theory, one of the most basic things you do with adults in the classroom is connect to their experience. And to say, well, we value you as a person who has lots of valuable experiences to bring to this classroom. So, you know, one way we could have taught research, practical research knowledge, is to say, this is what research knowledge is, here's what the textbooks and the other experts say. But what we did instead was to say, choose something that will be meaningful to you, and then experience collecting data. I mean, this was the first time we've done this. We hadn't done this before. So the results were unexpected. Yes. We didn't think that it was going to be as successful as it actually was. There's a question at the back.
Yeah, I guess it might end up being a bit of two questions. So I drew when you started talking about reflection and how you saw your day-to-day life. I kind of drew out my day-to-day life, and I imagined myself, outside thinking about something, and then so my question is, how did you get around the distractions and the to keep yourself, I guess, focused on collecting that data? What I drew was that my work and my interest, they all kind of mix, and they don't. I would find it very difficult to pull out data like that. So how did you get around the distractions of the world, of your work and home and things like that?
Can I add a little note before they respond as well? So that's such a good point. When new researchers go out to collect data on their research projects, that's exactly what they find. That's exactly the problem that they have to deal with, that it's totally overwhelming. There are so many things to do research on. So what we did in this project was to mimic that process around something much smaller and manageable. Do you want to?
I just want to say as well, that's the criticality part of it. The creative part, and creative sometimes when we look at the chaos, that's our lives. The criticality part, the analysis part, is having to make judgments about which parts I'm going to focus on, which parts I'm going to give priority to, and that's the part, constantly making the assessments, the discernments. That's the part that as a researcher we have to put together with our creativity. I think that those exemplary researchers think critically and creatively, and it's a learned process. And for these students, they've had the beginning of the learning of that process. Pat, did you?
Couldn't say it better. It is, I mean, you saw how I proceeded through my data sets. I started,
You should have the microphone, my friend.
I proceeded through my data sets and learned as I was going along. And it starts off very chaotically. If you think back to my Twitter, like that's all over the place. And I boiled it down to 5 things in my final thing. And even that might have been too much. But I tried to look for things that were changing as opposed to things that were constant all the time. Well, I'm going to focus on stuff that's not the same. But then I got the reflexivity too. So, did you want to?
Well, just to add to that, I think just narrowing it down to one thing. So reading the Dear Data the book was very helpful as well. They often went through door frames, and they would track how often they went through a door frame. It's fairly mundane sometimes, but really interesting. And for me, it was always just about, I had more needles those couple of weeks, but those needles they weren't loving me, so I didn't track it. So it was very, I had to be very deliberate and narrow down the focus.
I think we have to
I am sorry. Our time is up, and I have a sense that this is a conversation or a dialogue that could continue for hours. And I really do want to thank our panelists this morning, and perhaps sometime maybe over coffee break, because we have about 10 minutes for that before the next session begins. But maybe we can find other ways to continue this dialogue. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you.